zombie movies. So mostly, most of you don't even know what those Hollywood zombies are. By the way, the Hollywood zombies create a logic problem.
The light is interrupted.
Light's too bright?
Yeah.
How's that?
Better.
Okay. So the Hollywood zombies create a logic problem for a two-value logic where you only have truth and falsity, because not dead turns out not to be equivalent to dead. But we're not going to worry about this. So the philosopher zombies. They are creatures that are our exact physical duplicates, but which lack phenomenal consciousness. There are questions about different kinds of consciousness that we're not going to go into. That Ned Block is a famous philosopher of mind who distinguished three kinds of consciousness: phenomenal, access, and reflexive, which was very important. But we're not going to have to worry. We're not going to worry about that. You can easily, zombies are exact physical duplicates lacking, let's just say, consciousness. So here's what the zombie argument will show. If you can imagine that there are zombies in some possible world, then physicalism is false. Consciousness is non-physical. Think about that. If you can imagine your exact physical duplicate in some possible world lacking consciousness, then the mind, consciousness, is non-physical. That's unbelievable. That's a substantial conclusion. And it's a scientific conclusion. It's telling scientists that consciousness is more than just a matter of the physics of the brain. That there are non-physical aspects of it. And you get this conclusion out of imagining something to be so. If you can imagine your exact physical duplicate not having consciousness, then you've shown that there is some non-physical thing, consciousness. That's unbelievable. So let's start up to this. Let's move up to this fairly slowly. So let's just say a little something about phenomenal consciousness. One way of characterizing it is it makes mental. It's the what it's likeness aspect of some mental state. So suppose you're eating a peach. It's the what its likeness to the taste and the smell and the texture of the peach that's in the phenomenal consciousness mental state. So all of the sensory states that we're in are called phenomenally conscious mental states. Whether thoughts, desires, emotions count as being phenomenally conscious states, that's an issue that's up for grabs. Ned Block has argued that they are. But, oops. So let's go back to 1960. Before 1960, all the philosophers were in agreement, many philosophers were in agreement with the neuroscientists. The mind is identical with the brain. Mental states are brain states. And in 1960, Hilary Putnam, who was one of my first teachers in philosophy, actually in mathematics, he had a joint appointment in philosophy and mathematics at Harvard. And he's the only philosopher who is known for having done important work in mathematics. I mean, outside of logic, in pure mathematics. Many philosophers, including Saul Kripke, have done unbelievably important work in mathematical logic. But the problem Putnam worked on was outside of mathematical logic. So Putnam argued that the mind is not reducible to the brain, which is another way of saying it's identical with the brain, because any given mental state can be physically realized in different organisms in very different ways. So if you say a mental state is identical with a brain state, and a given mental state can be physically realized in many different ways in many different organisms, it can even be physically realized in different ways in the same organism. Each of our brains may have slight differences. And so, if mental states are identical with physical states, and the physical states that realize those mental states are disjunctive, then we really can't say that A is equal to B. The best you can do is say mental state is some big disjunction of physical states. But that's not an identity. Well, people responded to Putnam people responded to Putnam, people who thought that the mind is identical with the brain, and said, just look at human brains, and you will get a big disjunction. But at any rate, let's move on. In 1974, a philosopher, Tom Nagel, in a paper called What Is It Like to Be a Bat, he argued against mind-brain identity by using a metaphysical assumption called Leibniz's law. And this is, you can't deny the truth of this. If A and B are identical, then they share all their properties, because it's the same thing. A and B are the same thing. So they have to share everything because it is just one thing. So A and B can't have distinct properties. So if let F be a property variable, then you can put Leibniz's law in this way. If A and B are the same, then for all properties, A has the property if and only if B has the property. So if it's not the case that A and B share all their properties, then they're not identical by modus tollens. Well, what property could the mind have that the brain doesn't have?
Physical properties? I mean, not physical. The brain is physical while the mind is phenomenal.
So we haven't gotten to, this argument is not going to show the mind is non-physical and the brain is physical. All this argument does is show the mind is not identical with the brain. Same thing with Putnam's argument. It purports to show the mind is not identical with the brain.
But as you said, that
So we haven't even gotten to the point where we can say the mind is non-physical. All that this argument would do, if it works, Nagel's argument, is show the mind and the brain are not identical. But that's not going to show that one is non-physical and the other is physical. Okay, so what Nagel did was to say the what-its likeness of our experiences is a first-person description which cannot be redescribed in a third-person objective description. So the brain can be described purely from a neutral third-person description or perspective. But our experiences require a first-person description. Thus, there's a property mental states have which physical states do not have. And thus, they're not identical. That was his argument. And a variation on it was Frank Jackson's knowledge argument 8 years later. Suppose there's somebody blind from birth. And this person learns all the objective facts about color vision. Mary gets a PhD from Rutgers Newark in color vision. And she is the leading expert in the world in color vision. She knows every fact there is to know about color vision. But she lacks the experience of seeing objects in color. So this experience can't be an objective fact about color because she has them all. So if she acquires color vision, she doesn't acquire any new objective facts about it. What she acquires isn't a physical fact. Well, it's a fact about first-person experiences. So those were the arguments up through 1982 that involved Leibniz's law. But as we know from 2 weeks ago, Kripke in 1970 used a different kind of argument from Nagel's. Rather than use Leibniz's law outright, you use something that can be derived from Leibniz's law, and you can derive it from Leibniz's law, as I told you, using predicate logic. As you know, Sider makes the mistake of not citing Kripke, who in a footnote in a paper, Identity and Necessity, showed how you can derive the necessity of identity from Leibniz's law and predicate logic, using no modal logic. Sider thinks you need constant domain semantics, quantified modal logic with constant domain semantics to derive the necessity of identity. Well, in fact, you don't need that. And remember, we did this in class. We showed how, given Leibniz's law, and that it's necessary that for all x, x equals x, you can derive the necessity of identity. Okay, so you're familiar with this, how the argument's going to work. If you can imagine A not being identical with B, then they're not by modus tollens. So notice you don't have to do what Nagel did. You don't have to find some property A has that B doesn't have. All you have to do is imagine A and B not being identical. But as you know, the problem is that's too easy. So that's how the argument would work. If it's possible to imagine a pain state without an accompanying brain state, then they're not identical. But it's too easy. The argument is too strong. Because you could, by similar reasoning, show any scientific identity is false. So how did Kripke respond to that? Well, we went over this last week. If you imagine heat, let's take the scientific identity, heat is mean molecular motion. If you can imagine heat not being mean molecular motion, Kripke responds, you haven't imagined heat. What you've imagined is something that for you is qualitatively indistinguishable from heat, but it's not heat. And so it doesn't show anything. Because you haven't imagined it's heat that's not mean molecular motion. You've imagined something else that's qualitatively indistinguishable from heat that you say is not mean molecular motion. But that doesn't deny the identity. So, a fancy philosophical way of putting the point is the person who thinks that Kripke's reasoning is too strong because it can show any scientific identity as false hasn't appreciated that they confused epistemic possibility with metaphysical possibility. Metaphysical possibility means, in the broadest possible sense of what there is, both actually and modally, once you've shown X and Y are identical, they're identical in every possible world. And your state of knowledge has nothing to do with whether they're identical. You could confuse something with heat and say, ah, that's heat to me, because it's qualitatively indistinguishable from heat, but that doesn't make it heat. But why isn't Kripke then also confused about pain? Because if something is qualitatively indistinguishable from pain, it is pain. So you can't be epistemically confused about a pain state. In other words, if the objector says to you, you want to deny mind-brain identity. So you say, I can imagine pain without a brain state. The objector says, you haven't imagined pain without being brain. You've imagined something qualitatively indistinguishable from pain, which you say is not a brain state. But Kripke says, look, that's impossible. If something is qualitatively indistinguishable from pain, it is pain. End of the story. So all you have to do is imagine a pain state not being a brain state. You don't even have to specify anything more than that. You don't have to cite any neurophysiological literature. Just imagine that. And that shows that they're not identical. But how much can you get out of that non-identity? What does Kripke's non-identity argument show about the mind? If the argument is sound, it leaves open 6 possibilities. It leaves open that mental states are physical and supervene on the brain, that they're non-physical and supervene on the brain, that they're physical and don't supervene on the brain, that they're non-physical and don't supervene on the brain, that brain states supervene on physical mental states, or brain states supervene on non-physical mental states. So you have those 6 possibilities. So you can't get out of Kripke's argument that the mind is non-physical. Because these are the 6 possibilities compatible with the soundness of Kripke's argument. Chalmers early on, in the 1990s, asked, is it possible that an exact physical duplicate of me can lack phenomenal consciousness? If so, then it's not necessary that the mental state of phenomenal consciousness is identical to a brain state. But if you use Kripke's argument, that too, if you use Kripke's form of reasoning to establish that, it's still going to leave open all of these possibilities. In order to show that the mind is non-physical, you are going to have to bring a definition of physicalism into the very structure of the argument. And we want to define it in terms of necessity, because then we'll be able to use a conceivability argument. So, what is physicalism? The philosopher Frank Jackson, he's at Australian National University, and he visits Princeton a lot. He defined physicalism. Now, very broadly put, physicalism is the fundamental ontology, that's the objects and their properties of the world of physical. So Jackson said there's a fundamental vocabulary in which there is a complete, fundamental, true description of the world. And that's physicalism. How do we know physicalism is true? Here is a necessary condition for the truth of physicalism. All truths in the world are metaphysically necessitated by the complete fundamental true description. So, for all truths, for all world truths, it's necessary that the truth follows from the complete fundamental true description of the world. And so, this is a necessary condition for the truth of physicalism, that any truth whatsoever, that it's necessary that any truth whatsoever follows from the complete fundamental world description. So if you can find a possible world where a truth doesn't follow from the fundamental world description, then you've shown physicalism is false. So notice what you have to accept. You have to accept this and this to even set the argument up that physicalism is false. If you deny either point, you can't set the argument up. So here's how the zombie argument will work. Let Q be a phenomenal truth. such as Jack is having a visual experience with a particular phenomenal character at a particular time. Let that be Q. And it's a truth. So, if it's possible that you have a complete fundamental world description and don't have Q, exact physical duplicate, no physical consciousness, this is zombie. This is the zombie. It doesn't look scary, does it? And if you shoot this with a bullet, you won't kill it. You'll just put a hole in the screen right here. So, if this is possible, then it's not the case that for every truth it's necessary that the truth follows from the fundamental description. So, if you can conceive of a zombie, then the necessary condition for the truth of physicalism is false, and thus physicalism is false. So this is where all the action is. If you can conceive of a zombie, if it's possible for there to be a zombie, that's to say if it's possible for there to be a complete fundamental world description and no conscious mental state. So your complete description, physical description, will come under this. So if you can imagine a possible world in which you have your exact physical duplicate without consciousness, then you show physicalism is false. Well, I just went over this, so we'll move on to the next one. Another way to make the same point, that's a necessary condition for the truth of physicalism, as Jackson stipulated in his argument. So Q is a universal instantiation of this. If I let Q be one of the truths and substitute Q for T, I get this. This is UI, universal instantiation. So if this is true, then this conditional is true in every possible world. So if you can imagine a possible world, the zombie, then this is false, and so that's false. Minimally, it shows phenomenal consciousness. Chalmers' argument shows phenomenal consciousness is non-physical. And it doesn't supervene on brain states. Because if it did supervene on brain states, then whenever we had the complete fundamental world description, we'd have Q as well. So this is very astonishing. What did fMRI brain scans show us about phenomenal consciousness? Perhaps nothing. We don't know. There may be some physical features necessary for consciousness, but they can't all be necessary, because otherwise it would supervene, conscious states would supervene on physical states. So this would be astonishing. And then there'll be physical effects of phenomenal consciousness, but that doesn't show us what phenomenal consciousness is. And if phenomenal consciousness is non-physical, the other kinds of consciousness, access consciousness and reflexive consciousness, maybe they're not physical as well. But that's not something we can worry about. Okay, I have 4 arguments against Chalmers' argument. Before me, my colleague in this department, Kati Balog, argued against Chalmers, and I think her work is probably the best stuff that was done in philosophy of mind between 1997 and 2010 or so. I'm not going to use her arguments or arguments that even look like hers. And I'm going to use two results in mathematical physics that have never before been discussed in the zombie literature. The first argument is just a simple argument about critical thinking, using critical thinking skills, that it begs the question. So Chalmers asked if it's possible that there's an exact physical duplicate of yourself without phenomenal consciousness. So if there is, then there's some possible world in which your exact physical duplicate exists, but without phenomenal consciousness. In imagining such a world, all the essential properties of my exact physical duplicate are preserved. Because if any were missing, it wouldn't be an exact physical duplicate. So my DNA is an essential property of me and my exact physical duplicate. So if I imagine a possible world where the DNA is slightly different, it's not my exact physical duplicate. So this is a fundamental point about possible world semantics. And now here's the question. Is phenomenal consciousness an essential property of my exact physical duplicate? If it is, then I can't imagine my exact physical duplicate without it. Zombies are impossible. If it's not, then I can imagine my exact physical duplicate without it. Having a right arm is not an essential property of me. I can imagine me without a right arm. On the other hand, if my exact physical duplicate lacked an arm, it would not be my exact physical duplicate. So it appears that you first have to know whether phenomenal consciousness is or is not an essential property of my exact physical duplicate before you can imagine my exact physical duplicate without consciousness. Just 1 second, and I'll finish the slide, then I'll take the question. So, if it is an essential property, I can't imagine a zombie. If it is not an essential property, I can imagine a zombie. Thus, whether it is or is not an essential property of my exact physical duplicate is equivalent to whether or not a zombie is possible. To assume it is not essential property of my exact physical duplicate begs this question. Is it or is it not an essential property of my exact physical duplicate? Yeah.
What about if you consider things like vegetative states? Then the worlds that exist with non-phenomenal consciousness are the world before an incident that leads to vegetative state, and the world that exists after the incident that leaves you in that vegetative state. So there's no consciousness at one point in time, but at an earlier point in time there's consciousness. So there are two worlds that exist at different points in time.
Let me return to that later. Because when I gave this talk 4 years ago in the psychology department, Kent Arbor raised the same issue. And I addressed this later on. So let's hold on for that one. Okay? That's an excellent question. Okay, somebody who's defending Chalmers might criticize me and say, look, all you have to do is stipulate that your exact physical duplicate exists in some possible world. So the issue about essential properties is a non-starter. Well, that's not going to go anywhere. If it's a non-starter, it's not a non-starter because what I have to imagine is my exact physical duplicate. And so the issue is precisely what are the essential properties it must have to be my exact physical duplicate. I can't just stipulate it exists. I have to know what the essential properties are. And whether phenomenal consciousness is or is not an essential property of my exact physical duplicate is the question. So, we can get more sophisticated about this. If consciousness is not an essential property of my exact physical duplicate, Chalmers wins. If consciousness is an essential property of my exact physical duplicate, Chalmers loses. So if Chalmers imagines this exact physical duplicate without consciousness, he wins. Okay, you have to be careful. If that reasoning is sound, then you could prove any necessary truth, any mathematical truth is false. Here's how. If I can imagine the prime number theorem is false, I win. If I can't imagine the prime number theorem is false, I lose. So if I imagine the prime number theorem is false, I win. If you succeed in imagining it's false, you win. Or if you do succeed in imagining your physical duplicate without consciousness, you win. But we know you can't succeed in imagining the prime number theorem is false because it's necessarily true. So we would know that consciousness is not an essential property of one's exact physical duplicate if and only if we know we can imagine our exact physical duplicate without consciousness. There's another kind of semantics for possible worlds in which you don't have exact physical duplicates. You have counterpart relations. So I can exist in another possible world on this semantics if someone like me, but not exactly identical with me, is in that world. At any rate, that's an alternative semantics for possible worlds that was developed by David Lewis, who you guys know from his criticism of Stolnecker and his work on counterfactuals, where he dropped Stolnecker's limit assumption for his theory of counterfactuals. The problem is that in counterpart semantics, universal instantiation comes out false, and so you don't want to give that up when you imagine an exact physical duplicate, because as I showed you, the argument to show that the necessary condition for physicalism is false uses universal instantiation. You need universal instantiation to get a zombie, so if universal instantiation is false in your semantics, the whole structure of the Chalmers argument breaks apart. Second argument. Believe it or not, we will finish this before 8 o'clock. Stay awake.
Sorry.
It's almost over. And remember, you'll be appearing on YouTube. So you don't want to be on YouTube asleep. Okay. No cloning theorem for mathematical physics. This was developed by Wooter, Zurich, and Deeks in 1982. And it basically, the basic statement is, you can't clone a quantum state. Because if you did, you would violate the uncertainty principle. So, here's how I'm going to use the no cloning theorem. In imagining my exact physical duplicate, I should start with the physical components. So I imagine a possible world in which I start with the physical components and build up. Why? Because I have to rule out the following possibility when I imagine a possible world with my exact physical duplicate. In order to conclude that phenomenal consciousness is non-physical and doesn't supervene on brain states, I have to rule out that phenomenal consciousness is emergent property that supervenes on brain states, though not identical with the brain state. I also have to rule out another possibility, that consciousness just is a physical state, though manifested in some complex and unusual way, such that quantum level differences make a difference in whether or not it is manifested. So the idea is, in imagining a possible world with my exact physical duplicate, I imagine that I build this exact physical duplicate up, piece by piece, atom by atom, in this possible world. But you can't do it. No cloning theorems tell me I can't do this. Because if I could, here's what I could do. In the real world, I could measure the position of part of myself, an atom in my arm, say. And in the possible world, I can measure its momentum. And since it's an exact physical duplicate, it's the exact same thing. So I could get information that I'm not allowed to have because it would violate the no cloning theorem. Kati Balog objected to this when she heard this talk 4 years ago. She said, although the argument shows there is a problem for epistemic possibility, what I can imagine with respect to what I know, the no cloning arguments show that it is not epistemically possible to discharge an objection to zombie construction of possible worlds. The argument fails to address the notion of possibility relevant to zombie arguments. Are they metaphysically possible? That's to say, could there be some possible world where there is an exact physical duplicate of myself without consciousness, period? It's a powerful objection. I cannot, in the actual world, now, in the actual world, I can't build an exact physical duplicate of myself. But does that show in no possible world that there is an exact physical duplicate of myself? I contend no cloning theorems describe what is metaphysically possible. In each possible world, an exact physical duplicate of myself can't be constructed. But that doesn't show that in no possible world is there an exact physical duplicate of myself. It just shows that I can't construct it in any possible world. But recall the no cloning theorem. If you clone quantum state, then you could measure A's position and B's momentum, violating the uncertainty principle. Suppose the clone B exists in another possible world V. A exists in the actual world W, and B exists in V. B's momentum can still be measured in V. Indeed, we can easily imagine in W how the measurement in V would go. But we're prohibited from having this knowledge. We cannot, in W, imagine the value of the momentum of B in V. We may think we're imagining the value, but that is merely because we are mistaking an epistemically possible world for the possible world V. Once we know the position of momentum can't be simultaneously known, we can imagine a world in which the position of A is known, and another world in which the momentum of B is known, where A and B are exact duplicates of one another. So, although it might be that there is an exact physical duplicate of me in world V, we cannot justifiably imagine that to be so. And since if we are justified in imagining it, we have evidence that it really is an exact physical duplicate. Such evidence would consist of specifications of basic physical quantities such as position and momentum. But we can't provide these, and so we're not justified in what we claim to imagine in world V. We could imagine possible worlds in which the laws of physics break down, for which there are no cloning theorems. But to imagine exact physical duplicate without consciousness in such a world would beg the question of whether the breakdown of physical law is responsible for my exact physical duplicate not being conscious. In which case, imagining an exact physical duplicate of myself without consciousness in such a world would show us nothing about the nature of consciousness. That's to say, whether it's non-physical or not. So, finally, either we imagine a possible world in which the no cloning theorem holds, in which case we can't, in the actual world, imagine an exact physical duplicate of myself in another possible world, or we imagine a possible world in which the non-cloning theorem fails, in which case it shows nothing about the nature of consciousness. So either the no cloning theorem holds or fails. Third argument, where the physical and non-physical meet, the interface. If phenomenal consciousness is non-physical, how does it happen that we experience it in our heads? Now this is an old kind of objection that goes back to Descartes. Where does the non-physical meet the physical, and how could there be causal contact? Where in the brain? So I've made a little improvement in it. So take conscious visual experiences. It appears we have to posit God in order to make sure the visual phenomenal experiences co-occur with the neural activities of visual information processing. Otherwise, there must be an interface where the non-physical and the physical meet. Now I'm going to pose a problem for the interface. This is the logic of the interface, where the physical and the non-physical meet. Physical and non-physical properties mix at the interface. I contend there'll be propositions about their mixture that we can't tell determinately true or determinately false. Thus, it's possible that it's not the case that for all substitution instances of x, you have A or not A. I say that's so at the interface. And now I'm going to do this fast. I have a derivation starting from that premise. I get this. You guys can double check the proof, the steps in the proof. And what does it use? It only uses necessitation, which is valid for all modal systems. It's valid for K. And also necessity, possibility, negation. You can define this possibility in terms of necessity. It's necessary if and only if it's not possible that it's not. And you can define the possibility in terms of necessity. It's possible if and only if it's not necessary that it's not. Well, starting from here, I get to this. It's not possible that for all substitution instances, A are not A. And that is, in the philosophical literature, a definition of anti-realism, which is the view that, to distinguish it from realism, that there are things that don't have determinate objective truth conditions. Another way of putting it is things that are simply products of the mind. And they're not real. So this is a big problem. The logic of the interface starts with what seems to be fairly obvious about the nature of the interface, with a physical and a non-physical meet. And from that, I can get a statement of anti-realism, which is kind of ironic, meaning this interface really is just a human invention. It's not an objective fact about the world. So, this I think is a powerful objection to the argument. Because you don't want to say the interface with a physical and non-physical meet, it's just some human invention. Something we cook up. Okay, finally, the very last argument. This is an unbelievable piece of mathematics. Very few people know about this. It appeared in a paper in 1952 by a Berkeley mathematician, and it's called An Indeterminate Problem in Classical Mechanics. And what this guy showed is that Newtonian mechanics is indeterminate. This is unbelievable. Well, there's the statement of it. Before we get to this, he showed that take a ball rolling down an inclined plane. At the base of the plane is another ball which the rolling ball strikes. The rolling ball transfers momentum to the ball that's standing still. Newtonian mechanics tells us how the transfer of momentum goes. What Gale proved is that there are two different ways the momentum could go in terms of the final value. So every physicist thought it's unique. There's one answer to what the momentum of the transfer is. Gale showed there's two. It's indeterminate which one will happen. This is not chaos. This is not a question of having wildly divergent behavior occur with very slight variations in initial conditions. Here, assume the initial condition of the ball falling down the inclined plane is fixed with infinite precision. When that ball hits the other ball, the amount of momentum transferred is indeterminate between two different values. And there's no way of knowing which one it is. That's the fact I'm going to use. Okay, let's go back. That's the necessary condition for physicalism.
Professor?
Yeah.
So did it work experimentally? Like half the time did it go one way and the other half the other way?
You know, that's a great question. I don't know whether physicists have done that work.
Okay.
Very few people know about this. It was one of those papers that didn't create a sensation. I found out about it, Saul Kripke told me about it many years ago. It struck me as unbelievable. It's like an analog of Quine's indeterminacy of translation, we're told with respect to language, in the physical world, with respect to our physical laws. A lot of physicists just don't even think about it. They don't worry about it. But here's how I'm going to use it for another anti-zombie argument. Okay, so here's the assumption you have to make. Suppose the result of this Newtonian indeterminacy, and it's going to hold in the brain. is that either a state of phenomenal consciousness results, or some other purely physical brain state, which is not a phenomenal consciousness state, results from the fundamental world description. So there'll be a universal instantiation of the necessary condition for physicalism of this form, where instead of just Q, you have a disjunction. Given the fundamental world description, then either there'll be a phenomenal conscious state or a non-phenomenal physical state.
So this would refer to the question I posed, right?
What's that?
This refers to the question I posed earlier about the vegetative state?
What's that now?
This refers to the question I posed about the vegetative state, right?
No, we still haven't gotten to that one yet. Okay. So given Newtonian indeterminacy, the right-hand side of that conditional we can now write as a disjunction. You're either going to get, from the fundamental world description, a phenomenal conscious state or a non-phenomenal physical state in the brain. So, this is zombie, but that will not show that this is false, because the consequent of that conditional is a disjunction. And to show this is false, you have to show both components are false, Q and P. So just imagining a zombie is not going to show that that's false. But P is a physical property or aspect of my exact physical duplicate. It's also a physical property or aspect of me. So the only way that I can get this, which would show the necessary condition for physicalism is false, would be to imagine me without P. But in that case, I've imagined myself as missing some part of myself. So I haven't imagined an exact physical duplicate of myself. So this refutes the zombie argument, since the argument wouldn't work where I cannot imagine an exact physical duplicate of myself. So look at what we have to assume. We have to assume that the fundamental world description of Jackson, in conjunction with Gale's theorem, yields either a conscious phenomenal state or a purely physical brain state. But I have the burden of proof on Chalmers. For him to argue against me, he has to show this disjunction is physically impossible, that there is no possible world in which I can imagine it to be so. So long as it's a physical possibility, it defeats his zombie argument. Why? Because even if it's false in the actual world, that we get this kind of disjunction to create an exact physical duplicate by the no-cloning theorem, whichever world we imagine, we cannot rule out that the disjunction follows from the fundamental world description there, since we know only that it follows from fundamental world description in some possible world. Well, you don't need the logic workshop. You've had this stuff. And you've had this. So here's the way of putting it. Premise one is my elaboration of the conditional. So I say it follows from the fundamental world description that I have either a phenomenal conscious state or just a purely physical state. Okay, then I can do commutativity, implication, exportation. That's a zombie. So by modus tollens from 4 and 5, I have this. Then by De Morgan's theorem, I have this. So 7 says that either the fundamental world description is false or P is true. Thus, either physicalism is false or some physical condition P is present in an actual human body. I leave it to you to decide which disjunct is true. Or, put another way, 7 says either the fundamental world description is false or Q is true. Thus, either physicalism is false or I experience some phenomenal conscious mental state. I leave it to you to decide which disjunct is true. Maybe both are true. So, what do these results show? If Chalmers argues that though squiggle Q and squiggle P is not a zombie, physicalism refuted just the same, since the necessary condition for physicalism is false. Well, these conditionals can be rewritten in a logically equivalent form using exportation, in which either the fundamental world description is false or some trivial condition obtains. P obtains or Q obtains. So I can't see Chalmers as getting anything out of that. We could also do this at the quantum level and get the same results if we move down to a quantum description of the mind. Okay, here's a criticism. If Q or P is possible, then the correct conditional is that it's possible Q or P follows from the fundamental world description. My response is there's another easier way to introduce P. Start with this, which Chalmers allows. This is universal instantiation of the necessary condition. Addition, implication, association, implication. And I get it purely by moving logic. So, this gets me Q or P in a non-question begging way. I don't have to say Gale's theorem is true or false. I can get it independently. I can get the same logical statement without appealing to Gale's theorem, just by using laws of logic. But Gale's theorem motivates this condition. Let's see. There's a dialectical advantage of my disjunction argument. If this is true in the actual world, Chalmers' argument wouldn't succeed. To show that Q or P is not true in the actual world, Chalmers have to assume Q is physical and then argue that Q or P can't happen. But then he loses because Q is physical. Or you have to assume Q is non-physical, but that begs the question. This takes us a little further afield. I'll skip that tonight. Let's go to okay. some of these, I pulled some real, I think some mind-boggling stuff out, but I skipped those slides. Kati Balog objected to my use of the Gale's theorem. She said you got to distinguish what's causally necessary from what's constitutively necessary. What's necessary for constituting a human being. It's not clear that Gale's theorem shows nothing more than the indeterminacy is causally necessary. So there's an indeterminacy in any Newtonian system at the cause and effect level. But to use Gale's theorem against all the arguments, you have to show that the indeterminacy is constitutively necessary, or not merely causally necessary. Suppose the indeterminacy is not constitutively necessary, then there'll be possible worlds where the indeterminacy fails to occur constitutively, constituting the human brain of some particular human being. But we don't have that worry, since we merely raise the possibility that there's some world in which the indeterminacy is constitutively necessary in constituting the brain of some particular human being in the actual world. So all my argument means that it's possible that the indeterminacy is constitutively necessary. So there must be some possible world, with respect to that, where the constitutively is constitutively necessary. Now the thing is, if this is occurring in the brain, it's either going to result in a physical state, a physical part of the brain, or a phenomenal conscious part of the brain. In either case, it's going to constitute that person. And so it'll be necessary. Because you're either going to get one or the other, but you're still going to get that person being constituted out of that particular causal interaction. Okay, finally, this takes your thing. When I gave this talk 4 years ago, in the question-answer period, Kent Harper said, you know, you can be your own zombie. And he cited what you talked about earlier. There are transitions from consciousness to non-consciousness that might occur with no physical change in the body. We just show consciousness is non-physical. I said to Kent at that talk, no. I said, Kent, you had a good idea, but this is what Kent would allow us to have. Consciousness at time one follows from the fundamental world description. Unconscious at time two follows from the same fundamental world description. Both of these conditionals are true, but what we need to show consciousness is non-physical is this at T1 and this unconscious at T1. You would have to be both conscious and unconscious at the same time for non-physicalism to be so.
Why is that? I mean, wouldn't the conditional of neurological events mean that the phenomenal would be a result of the physical? And once the physical has been damaged or altered, so is the phenomenal. So it's a cause and effect. It's causal of one. So time means nothing if you're looking at it that way, because one has to be in place for the other.
Here's why. If one follows in time, so if consciousness first, and then at a subsequent moment you're unconscious, even if there's no, well, there's still going to be, you know, first he has to be careful that it doesn't beg the question, because if you're conscious at one moment and unconscious at another, and you say there's absolutely no difference with respect to the fundamental world description, that's to say, you are your exact physical duplicate, but in one state you're conscious and in the next state you're not conscious.
Which wouldn't be true because there would have to be some sort of damage
Yeah,
to leave it that way.
The only, you know, the only way you could show is if both happen at the same time. So you are in one state and conscious and unconscious at the same time. So you have consciousness with respect to that and unconsciousness with respect to that. But that makes no sense. You can't be both conscious and unconscious at the same time.
But thinking critically, it would be possible.
Otherwise you'll beg the question as to whether, in fact, there is no change. And so at T2, when you're unconscious, you are the exact physical duplicate of yourself at T1.
Yeah. So you would say
They're almost impossible.
and you say it's not the same thing.
First, it's almost impossible just in terms of your body. As time goes by, there are motions of atoms in your body. And so the exact physical duplicate at T1 can't be preserved at T2. It's impossible. And how do you know that those little changes in, say, momentum or positions of molecules or whatever are responsible for phenomenal consciousness or the lack of it? So he would have to show, first of all, he's wrong. There can't be at T2 an exact physical duplicate of myself from T1. It's physically impossible.
Because it's already been altered through the course of time.
Because the particles that I'm built out of are going to be changing. They don't stay the same from one moment to the next. So the only way he could work that is if you're conscious and unconscious at the exact same moment. But that's impossible. So that's the talk. And if you want to email me or talk to me about it, I'd be really glad to hear what you have to say.